Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodian of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to their elder, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Then I pay my special respect to the fallen hero from Spring Revolution in Myanmar. I also thank AMI presenter Khaing Phyu and Joe and all our participants from different parts of the world to join AMI seminar today. Our AMI President, Christopher Lam, will open the meeting. Chris, the floor is yours.
It's muted itself again now. I hope it lasts long enough for me to say it's very, very good to be able to be with so many people already today, and we have a quite large number for this time, and we will get more as the evening goes on. Thank you for being here. We have a very interesting panel tonight. Khaing Phyu Htut is from Yangon, where she's with the British Council or British Embassy or both there, and she's in Australia now on a joint fellowship with Melbourne University and ANU. And so far as I know, this is the first time there's ever been a joint fellowship between the two universities. So it's a big honor for us to be able to have the recipient of that honor with us to talk about Myanmar and education. Following on what we did last month, which was to talk about youth in Myanmar and the youth following the Spring Revolution, now we can see something serious in terms of education policy and practice about the way the youth are being prepared by the education system for the country. And we all know that that day, when it comes, and it will, it's going to be very important for Myanmar to have a credible, well-prepared youth population who can take the governance of the country into its own future. And so Khaing Phyu will speak about that. Jolo Bianco has got a long history in Myanmar's education, as you know. He's now an emeritus professor at Melbourne University, but he was with the Graduate School of Education before that. And we have the great good fortune to have with them to offer a comment at the end, Edgar Rodriguez, who's from the International Development Research Center of Canada. He's based in New Delhi, but he's the team leader for Myanmar, and he will offer some comments at the end because his organization is very deeply committed to education in Myanmar. So, Khaing Phyu, the floor is yours. And I should say to everybody, as you listen to what they say and you think of questions that you might ask when we get to the Q&A time, please put those questions into the chat room on this, and we will then consolidate the questions when the time comes for Q&A, as usual. Khaing Phyu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So thanks to AMI and everyone for being here with me today. I am here now as the Research Fellow of University of Melbourne and ANU. So my special thanks go to ANU, Melbourne, and also the supporters of the Research Fellowship. It is really an honor to be doing this seminar together with Professor Joe and Dr. Edgar. So let me share my presentation. I hope you can see it. So I'll be talking about education challenges in Myanmar and the outlook. So actually, none of you need me to tell you that education in Myanmar is in an unfortunate and in an unprecedented crisis. But at the same time, I would like to give a few highlights as the backdrop of our seminar today. So this is the brief outline. I'll be looking at pre-COVID-19 and the political crisis and after. And I will be looking at the outlook I have, which is my personal outlook. I have a name for it. And then I will look at the future the outlook tells. And I would like to end my presentation in a positive note. I like actions more than words. So I would like to see what aid can do, especially education aid can do, a sector that I work in now. So even before the pandemic and the political crisis, Myanmar children, they were not learning. as you can read in the school section, you can see there were inequalities for the most marginalized and hard to reach, although you might be fooled by the net enrollment rate, which was 97%. So according to the AGMA assessment, 71% of our grade 1 kids could not read a single word. 57 of our grade 2 students could not perform a single subtraction. And in 2019, according to CPLM, only 11% of our grade 5 students demonstrated reading literacy skills, which is at the level of their age. And only 5% of grade 5 students demonstrated desired level of writing proficiencies, and only 3% of grade 5 students demonstrated mathematics proficiencies. If we look at the university sector, the enrollment is bad. You can see 94 youth studying in universities in 2018. That will be 19 only for Myanmar. And there were regional disparities between urban and rural areas. If we look at the curriculum content of teaching and methodology, it is outdated, theoretical curriculum, and very high teacher-student ratio. So most higher education degrees are not relevant to life. Research output was very low. There was little quality and impact. And surprisingly, because there was no sufficient funding or support for researchers. And from universities, they could do very limited technology transfer. So right just before the coup, there was a nascent quality assurance system, but even that was limited by the centralized government NANS and constant rotation of staff at universities. And as you all know, the allocation of education budget is really low. Higher education received only about 0.3% of GDP. That is according to Dr. Jamil Salmi, tertiary or higher education specialist, who did the review in 2020. Now the situation is infinitely worse. As you can see in the map of Myanmar, conflicts are rife in many areas of Myanmar, and then many children and families, they are on the run. And you can also see that children and youths, they are joining armed forces or are being recruited into armed forces. Schools are under attack. So that means that many youths and children, they have no future at all. Sexual exploitation, human trafficking, and drug use are increasingly becoming very high. And the last, but definitely not the least, and also not the end of the list, we have an unbridgeable divide between teachers, parents, and students who supported the revolution, who do not support the revolution, or who can't support the revolution. There are many reasons for that, but so all these culminate in an outlook which I named as 81% lost generation. This is based on only one piece of evidence, hard evidence that we could see in the enrollment rate of matriculation exam between 2019 and 2023. In 2019, we will see that more than 850,000 youths of Myanmar, they were prepared to take the exam, and then that means they were about to enter universities. In 2023, we saw only 160,000 youths entering metric exams. So that means 81% of the youths, where did they go? I could not lie myself that they might be in private education sector or elsewhere receiving education, because the most recent report of World Bank mentioned that 92% of Myanmar students, they have only state schools to access. In non-state schools, there is only 80%. So we definitely have a lost generation. My main worry is whether they will be able to get a good enough life in future. So from the outlook, what I can look at is conflicts. They are at the center of everything. So because of conflicts, people do not trust each other anymore. We don't know who is who anymore, and we don't know our way anymore. even in education. Because of this lack of trust and understanding among each other, we cannot collaborate. We are a society which is going inward instead of going outwards or growing outwards, because we cannot go outward anymore in this context. So because of these, what we see is the creation of silos and gaps. So I'm seeing silos even in education sector. Development partners, they are working on their own. Ministry of Education, it is working on its own. And then we cannot talk. We cannot collaborate as we used to in the past. That is replicated in communities as well. And then that is also seen in children and youth and society. And there are lots of inequalities rising. For example, between the youths who cannot go out of the country at all, who are stuck at the borders, who can go abroad, who can have quality education, who can't have quality education. They are creating massive inequalities and gaps. So these silos and gaps in turn create divisions and distrust, which feed into the conflict again. So it's like we are trapped in a vicious circle. As I mentioned, we don't give up. For education people, we will keep on doing what we can from whatever corner we find ourselves in. I work in the education aid sector, so I attach hopes in education, and I can definitely discern positive potential for aid people as long as they are ready to take more risks, more responsibility, more accountability, and also flexibility. So for example, with the booming private education sector, even in slum areas, we can see private education, but with very reasonable fees. So why don't we invest more in accessible private education? And there are community-based organizations who can be as flexible as they can be in whatever context they find themselves in. So at least they are providing some sort of education to children. And then they are fostering collaboration and networks. So these collaboration and networks are also really important for us, for support and for engagement and for encouragement. And so I really like to thank networks like AMI for this collaborative network and sharing. So what we can also hope for is education across barriers. In the 8 programs that I help in Myanmar, for example, there is one program, Myanmar Education Consortium. It works across different geographical areas and different ethnic education groups. So it is ready to go more for inclusion, more for coordination. And I also hope that there can be a space for peace and stability to foster through these things. So what we are aiming to do is to have less dropouts. That can be through flexible non-formal education programs, which Ministry of Education is also running, but I don't know the status of it. But any program or any system should allow transition, because we should put children at the focus. And then we should also put their country's interest, so that youths are our future. We should not create barriers between those youths and children. So very importantly, as the area of Professor Joe, mother tongue-based multilingual education, this is really crucial for ethnic children so that they don't face more barriers when they come to schools. And definitely support to teachers. The teachers are always at the lowest socioeconomic level in Myanmar. They have very low salaries, so we definitely should be thinking about them. And then they have very limited space to grow. So I definitely look forward to more support to teachers. So I do this presentation in the hope of hearing more from you and then discussing with you on the ideas and solutions. So as I said in the beginning, it is not a surprise to you that Myanmar education is in a crisis, but I hope to find answers together with you. So that's the end of my presentation. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Khaing Phyu. There's an awful lot that you said that people will have questions on, and they will come back in the end, I'm sure, to the question of what it is that Australia should do, either as a government or as private people, however we can organize ourselves. But now we've moved the microphone to Joe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Allow me to share the screen and I'll start my presentation. I want to say first I hope everyone can see what is about to come up. Yes, my
Yes.
PowerPoint. Thank you very much. What a pleasure it is to be speaking alongside Khaing Phyu, whose work I greatly admire, and Dr. Edgar, whom I haven't met before. So that's a pleasure this evening. I'm going to speak not so long because I think the important points have already been made so well and eloquently by Khaing Phyu, but I do want to make some points in some of the areas that were raised. This is possibly redundant, but I do want to just begin by reflecting on really how productive the brief window of openness 5 years ago was. It not just because of the contrast with today, which of course could not be more stark, but also when you look back on it, it is a period in which there was some very intense, productive work done by many people in the area that I'm interested in: language, literacy, multilingualism, linguistic human rights, as you can see in the middle paragraph there. This is just a small number of the laws that were passed in that period of time, some of which were limited in scope but radical by what they replaced, and others were radical in absolute terms. The National Education Law in 2014 and 15, which quite a few of us participating today had an input into. The protection of the rights of the National Races Law, the television and radio law, which provided considerable latitude to broadcasting in languages other minority languages, and then the detailed and I think very impressive comprehensive education sector review, which led to the National Education Strategic Plan, which has not been replaced, of course, but has come to the end of its term, or it did at that critical point when we know what happened on the 1st of February 2021. What's important to say about these things is that there was enormous collaborative policy making effort involved. The National Network for Education Reform, led by Dr. Tan Nguyen, UNICEF, UNESCO, the aid organizations that Khaing Phyu has already mentioned, consultancies, our Canadian colleagues, ethnic organizations, the Myanmar Education Consortium, many agencies and organizations, proving that education is like a lightning rod of interest and participation for multiple groups of people around the world, and obviously touches the hearts of many people within Myanmar. The radical changes, even though they weren't as great as they could have been, in acknowledgement of the critical importance of ethnic languages for learning, was also a breakthrough. In retrospect, it was a window of optimism and reform after decades of military neglect. And I agree with Khaing Phyu that we should be as optimistic as we can be about the possibility that there will be recovery of these initiatives when the political environment allows. The language challenge is the one that I want to focus on mostly. Most people realize, of course, that most learners are learning from the Bamar language. That is their ethnicity and their language, but people don't recognize, just as exists in an English-speaking environment in Australia, that this doesn't mean that these students have no problems in learning or no challenges in learning. To a significant degree, they are learning the register of educated discourse, which is always different from colloquial language that you speak at home. This is as true of middle-class children in Sydney or Melbourne as it is true of middle-class children in Myanmar who are of the main ethnic group. But for minority communities represented there in the quote I give from the work of David Bradley on just very briefly, a few very selected references. For minority communities, this is an extra burden because they not only need to learn the language, they need to learn the educated register of that language, and they need to learn that and a writing system which may or may not be similar to the one that may or may not exist for the language they already speak, but they need to learn that often from teachers who, as Khaing Phyu correctly said, have not been supported very well. 70% of the teachers in the study that we did at UNICEF were posted to areas where they had no connection linguistically with any of the children in their classrooms. So there are multiple reasons why this was the case, historical, political ones, but also administrative ones. And they create barriers to learning, which are very, very significant. So many communities, as we know, organize non-formal and after-school language maintenance, and all aid organizations should be open to the possibility of supporting these groups, because they do provide a critical bridge to mainstream schooling and cultural knowledge that's really important. The curriculum doesn't really make a lot of allowances for minority children. There is a provision within the curriculum law that I supervised a PhD from someone last year who looked exactly at this, and it's it's really just the bare beginnings of what might be possible to do. It's important to keep in mind that 90% of students are in government schools, so all of these other educational experiences are there as well. As I said, the register, which is what we call a variety of a language, that's like the difference between formal and informal, or subject requirements in schooling, is quite difficult, a quite difficult challenge for many students, and this is a challenge that's true of all students, regardless of their language background, but doubly true for children who don't speak the main language of the community. As you can see there has been also a long history of the separation of the forms of language between high forms, which have excluded the participation of ordinary people, and what are called low forms, although that's really judgmental way to label these things, which are called a diglossia in sociolinguistics. But in the last 15 years, what was noted was that this was significantly bridged. There was some kind of linguistic democratization going on along with the experiment in political democratization. And this is really important. It's not possible to imagine forms of social justice and participation without attending to language. And some people think this is a highly specialized and therefore an area just for a minority of people interested in these things, but it actually should interest everybody, because if children and adults in this case as well cannot access the means of communication through which their politics is delivered, their health services are delivered, the social participation is mediated, if they cannot access these things, how else will the aspired for or wanted levels of inclusion be reached? They won't be. This is not a problem that's unique to Myanmar, but it's particularly characteristic of the society in recent times, when there has been very little openness to bridging these gaps, as we know, for the reasons that were just described before. So for ethnic language children, these challenges are compounded because, as I said, 70% of teachers are posted to areas whose languages they do not know. So for the teachers, there is a really difficult challenge, a challenge that's greater than teachers in our society have to face, and yet they are supported so poorly and their salaries are so low that many of them really struggle to get by. I won't talk much about this because Khaing Phyu has just mentioned it mostly, but I did put in a quote here from the recent study, and there have been very few recent studies, as you can imagine. I did one for the UN Committee on Women and Girls on ethnic minority girls just in the last year of my own project there in 2019. And it showed that there is both a deep gender characteristic and a language and ethnicity characteristic to being pushed out of schooling too early. But we can see by comparison with Malaysia and Vietnam, the majority of grade 5 children achieve the reading literacy skills expected of them by the end of primary school, and a further 18 and 10% of children were in the band just below that, very close to achieving that. So they had a very solid basis of reading literacy in the language in which they are taught. And for quite a few children in Vietnam and in Malaysia, this is not their native language either. But in Cambodia, in Laos, PDR, Myanmar, and the Philippines, this is much less true. And in fact, when you break down the statistics in Myanmar, is well behind the other three countries. So it's now very clear that the majority of children's relative position to their peers in Southeast Asia has deteriorated. And we can see in this golden period too, that there had actually been a substantial progress. Just compare, look at the top figures. In 2010, Myanmar's education expenditure was around 1.8% of GDP, an absolutely derisory investment. By 2020, that had increased to approximately 4.6%, which was the level that Thailand was investing in 2010, and again, more or less the same in 2020. Not far off Malaysia. Malaysia actually came off its top in 2010 to 2020, but then compare it to the much more substantial investment made in Vietnam, which is making significant strides. By comparison, at the bottom, you can see Australia invests 8.5%, and that's not counting everything. And I think we are a society that underinvests in education. So it's not going to be possible to have long-term peace and reconciliation and participation prospects in this country without very major investments in education at all levels. It's critical for society. The World Bank has recently become interested in a way it never has been in history in questions of ethnicity, minority languages, indigenous populations, and they finally did some meta studies that specialists had been doing for many, many years, and they looked at these things and they said there is a major economic payoff for society to invest better in supporting the strugglers, the people who are the cohorts of a community that are the furthest away from success in schooling. So all of these reverberating crises come back ultimately to success in schooling, and success in schooling must lead us back both to questions of language and literacy and to the access that these provide to students in their mother tongue, accessing the dominant language of the society, which is Burmese, but also English, which will be a required subject for them. And here I want to say, I've worked with many organizations all the way back many decades ago in Samoa and other places where there is a tendency in English-speaking societies to imagine that we need to push English and push English early into the primary school. In many cases, this is the worst thing we could possibly do. It's very important for children to be consolidated in their languages, in the national language that they must know, and before they study English. They will learn English better by doing this, and it's also more fair on them in the long run. So I'm going to finish now by saying that the process of reflection that I would bring to this is that the creativity in public policy making that we've seen in recent years and the desire from people in Myanmar to improve policy and improve education is absolutely extraordinary. It's no less true now than it was when the years of openness, relative openness, were there. And I think it's important that we respect that some of the achievements that were made in policy making, many of those will have to be redone, but there is a strong basis on which to build. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I must say that was extraordinarily interesting. And that, together with what Khaing Phyu had to say, has given us a really good base. But before we get to that and the Q&A, let's hear from Edgar.
Great. Well, thank you very much again for the invitation to provide some remarks at this very important meeting, Chris. I want to. I'm very humble to be part of this conversation, and definitely I don't think I would be doing justice to the presentation of Khaing Phyu Htut and Dr. Jovianco. Yet I just want to make a few remarks that would, from the perspective of the International Development Research Center, Canada, why we got into supporting knowledge for democracy in Myanmar. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is that what Chris just mentioned about the role of the Australian universities, such as Australian National University and University of Melbourne, doing things together. I'm going to get back to this point in a second, but the fellowship that that Khaing Phyu has so well been carrying out is also part of our engagement with these universities, because we need to do more joint work in order to overcome the challenge of education in Myanmar. And I think that that's a responsibility of donors, but also of institutions such as the ones we just mentioned from Australia. The reason why we had this initiative for the Knowledge for Democracy Myanmar, especially in the phase after the coup, was to support, as Chris mentioned, a new cohort of people who are being left in a vacuum, where their opportunities of education have been truncated, and where one of the only opportunities to continue education is to go out of their country and pursue it in different universities or different institutions or research centers. And this is the support that the initiative is giving, trying to work with these youth, with this young cohort of people who are, as I said, left in the vacuum, given the situation. Is our focus as an International Development Research Center is on promoting research. And one input of research that is important at any stage in any country is to have a healthy tertiary education sector. My remarks are going to be narrowed down or seen through that lens. We really need a vibrant university sector in the country in order to help promote research that would support evidence that will guide, in this case, the future a future democratic society in Myanmar. And that's not a small feat. In the case of support to universities, it's something that is that has a very peculiar aspects that I want to notice, and the presentations before me have actually touched on them. One is the mindset. It's very important to keep. We've heard about the importance of language. And in the case of university, although the language of communication could be Burmese or English, one important aspect is to have the mindset of openness. And in the case of Myanmar, given how centralized the system has always been, as Khaing has mentioned before, the universities were or are and continue to be heavily controlled and centralized by the government, did not open this possibility for dialogue and academic freedoms. So that's something that we all need to question and remember, that the legacy from where we're coming. So in the case of social sciences, public policy issues that a democratic society would need to have, as a reminder for the figures, is before the coup is only 0.1% of all the university students were enrolled in a program of such nature, when in most of the other countries in Asia, it's a third. So Myanmar had a huge deficit to overcome in terms of the mindset and the scope of this university education. So that's one point that is important to note. The second one I want to make is the investment is in universities and knowledge and research. It has to be long-term. It has to be long-term, and it has to be taken into account the new technologies that are coming up, such as the delivery online. Is online education or online universities or platforms have mushroomed now, and we need to pay attention to how they're regulated, how they are able to provide service, how meaningful they are for Myanmar. And when I mention online university education, I refer to this sector that Khaing has already mentioned, that is the private sector, is how big, how important it will need to be promoted. So It's a long-term investment, and people are thinking right now to Myanmar, because it's in crisis, we need to react with humanitarian support, and indeed it's extremely useful, but education is something we cannot neglect. There's been several years already in which not only children, but also youth have been lacking of any source of education in the case of Myanmar, and this is unacceptable. So what can we do? And that I move to my last point. What is that we could be doing as donors? Well, we need to be supporting more of education, higher education, at all levels of education. This cannot wait to have the problems, all the problems of Myanmar solved, all the political situation clarified. So in order to do that, one of the main things that we really need to do is to coordinate. Since many of the donors, well-intentioned projects are taking place, are being funded by multi-donors, but we're not coordinating enough, and that in itself might be a disservice to the future generations of Myanmar. So support, in the sense that the ongoing support that is coming out in terms of fellowships, in terms of scholarships, they're all very, very, very good, but sometimes we overemphasize or neglect certain aspects or certain groups. I cannot finish my remarks by mentioning that one group that needs a lot of the support in the case of Myanmar is the Rohingya population, which, as you know, even before the expulsion into Bangladesh or the exodus to Bangladesh, they have been deprived, or is a part of the population that has been deprived of education inside Myanmar, and not only tertiary education, but all levels. So how to overcome that? Donors should be looking at that, should be also working with the diaspora more openly, and trying to find out that education at the end of the day will be the best instrument, tool, weapon that we can give to younger generations to bring back a democratic country. I stop here. Chris, back to you. Thank you very much for allowing me this intervention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Edgar. As usual, wise words. Chair, you had a question before Edgar began. Is that still a question you want to ask? Chair?
I just said thank you. No.
No, before he spoke,
No.
you had your hand up.
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. We have some questions, as you can see, in the chat room, and one of them came quite early in the piece from Joanne Ritchie, who asked whether anybody here was teaching primary education in Myanmar, and there have been some answers there already. Would you like, Joanne, to expand on your question? What did you want to ask, if there were people who could say yes to your question?
Well, I'm currently taking computer classes, so I can teach better the little kids I have in Yangon, Bagan, Mandalay, different little villages. I have about 20 students. It's through Gift of Education Myanmar out of Washington, D.C. Now, just recently, we've met with Dr. Zaw Wei So. Now, is he the Minister of Education for NUG? He is? Okay. So we've been trying to get funding for a while, and just 2 weeks ago, he's finally recognized our group. But I am not a trained teacher, but I love children, and I've always worked with children. And it's not a difficult thing to do, is to teach some of these kids who cannot go to schools. 2 of my students come to their uncle's house to get Wi-Fi so they can learn. But I don't teach English. I teach like science, 8 planets, 7 countries, 7 continents, 5 oceans, really basic stuff, and it's wonderful. I mean, they're so happy, and I don't want to make them sad because of what's going on in the country, but I don't know, is anybody else doing this sort of thing? I don't know. And I have a TA who helps me, and we funnel the money through Myanmar through another business that is in Yangon. So we pay the TA quite a good salary to help present for me, because I'm terrible on the computer, but I love kids. So I didn't know if anyone else is doing that.
Well, let's see if anybody puts their comment into the chat room. We'll be able to come back to that.
But it's quite rewarding.
This also goes to the question asked by Liz about practical things that can be done to support the quality of education in Myanmar, especially as many foreign teachers have left. The issue of private schools interests me a lot, and it'd be good to get a comment from Khaing Phyu about private schools. To what extent do you see private schools as complementing what you said about the state school system in the country? Are they going to be able to step in and provide any real guide or support to what the state structure is failing to deliver?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Liz, for the question. When we say private schools, there can be different categories. So for private schools, they can be international schools where wealthy kids go, and private schools set up by Myanmar people, not termed as international, but use government curriculum, state curriculum, and then offer education with varying degrees of fees. Some of those fees, they may be accessible even to the most poorest percentile of Myanmar people. So for the first type, international schools, there are loads of international schools flowing in, although there are very limited number of qualified and trained teachers, as Liz has recognized. So here I see the need for a system and policy and regulations. But for systems and policies and regulations to work, we need stability, as I put as the heart of everything. So we need stability and buy-in from stakeholders to set it up together. Otherwise, teachers are cheated and parents are being cheated by many private institutions who are very much business oriented, and then they take the opportunity of chaos to make money rather than offering quality education. So to cut my answer short, I think we need stability first, and then policies and regulations, so that there is a good system to be built by all. And for private education in the second type, we need more of that. But at the same time, there are even issues with that, on which curriculum to use, and then which teachers to hire. So, and then what sort of legality they are in the eyes of the decision makers. So these will be discussed in the long run, I hope. I think, there is no definite answer at the moment.
Thank you. One of the difficulties that brings out to me, as do some of the other questions, is that if you have a state curriculum, but then you have private schools running a curriculum of their own that may or may not be the state curriculum, how can a country like Australia, or for that matter, Canada, how can you be sure that the people who are coming to you to study, because they've got scholarships or some sort of entry process into the country where they can study, how can there be any kind of recognition of qualifications? What do you see, Khaing Phyu, about the qualifications that people coming out of Myanmar carry with them, and the acceptability of those qualifications in other countries? And is it different for the people who are learning at the border? We mustn't forget there are a very large number of children at the Thai border, or, as is clear, in the areas where the EAOs have got schools, as Jim Richardson points out. What do the qualifications look like that these people bring? And what are we supposed to do in Australia to help schools here understand what the kids are bringing with them?
I think the first and most important thing is flexibility, and then entry-level requirements, and then assessment systems that are used in Australia, so that people, even without papers, can enter if he or she can demonstrate enough competency and skills. So for example, we have a lot of youth stuck in the borders. They don't have any papers because they had to leave their homes under various circumstances. So we can't ask them of formal papers. And some of the regional universities, they have been quite flexible with that. So for example, if they can show even enough evidence of their education, then they will be accepting them. But there are not many institutions like that. So again, as I said, flexibility and checkpoints. And on your question about recognition, it is also a valid point, because for children in Myanmar, as I said, most of them can access only state education. So state education accreditation is still very important for them. And then for them to cross overs across systems, other systems must be ready to accept their accreditation and recognition. So this is something I would like to support in building up cross transfers between systems and then recognitions. One good point is that for teenagers, they can now take GED exam or IGCSE exam. GED is more flexible and IGCSE is a bit more rigorous than GED, as I have heard, but these will only be a handful of people. Many people will not be able to take those exams because most of the subjects are in English. And then, as Professor Joe mentioned, English language teaching and learning is riddled with a lot of issues in Myanmar. So I think this is, I hope that is enough for the answer to the recognition and accreditation. I would like to take this chance to reply to Ashley, as I have promised, on the status of curriculum, the local curriculum work in different states and regions. In the previous years before 2021, there were good enough work. We won't call it optimal, but at the same time, there were good initiatives for local curriculum. I simply don't know what of these local curriculums, but what I have heard from one ethnic group, I should not name it, is that, the local curriculum and the ability to teach children in their own mother tongues, they are a bit worried that it might be used as a kind of political card in their negotiations with the power holders. So this is also quite political. And the latest news, as Ashley knew very well, is about the amendment to the National Education Law, which do not favor mother tongue-based multilingual education. And the insiders' information from the Ministry of Education is that they don't see much of the work going on. So, but I might be wrong, having, limited engagement with Ministry of Education at the moment and no formal dealings. Thanks.
That's very interesting. Joe, would you like to comment on this mother tongue point that's just been made?
Yes, it's a critical part of the demands that people make for federalism, for devolution of some kinds. It isn't, as Khaing Phyu just correctly said, it isn't something that's unproblematical. It has to be done in a very special kind of way that's tied to the standard curriculum of the school. The local curriculum provision, which varies from half a day to 1 day to just a few hours, is implemented quite well in some places and not at all in other places. Where it's implemented well, it's designed by teachers who don't just do it for cultural reasons, but they tie the experiences of local children to local culture to the actual curriculum tasks that they need to do in Burmese at the school in the primary level. When it's done like that, it reinforces the general learning that the children do. It encourages them to stay in school. It's a minority of cases where that happens. And I suspect it's much worse really than we probably realize now. But when it works well, it works very well, and it encourages children to stay in school, their families to support the school processes, to interact with the teachers. These things don't happen otherwise. They've got to be a basis in which to do it.
Thank you. Now, there was a question about, there were a couple of questions about ethnic armed organizations and teaching in ethnic areas. And the last of those questions was from Jim Richardson about avenues that you panelists might see that would ensure a degree of curriculum harmonization. The issue of mobility for the kids is very important to me. And from my limited experience of this particular sector, I've seen people who've been educated at the Thai border and have come back into a system where there's no harmonization really done, and it's very difficult for the kids to fit back into the system in their own home country. Do you have any comment on that, Khaing Phyu? What's your experience of kids crossing ethnic boundaries with their education and then coming back to somewhere else and then going wherever?
As far as I have heard, this has been more difficult than before, because in the past, the Ministry of Education, they had a program which allowed children to come and attend their state schools and then leave somewhere else and then come back in. They call it alternative education. So I think it takes two sides. Children are not joining MOE systems, and then MOE is also having hardships and challenges to encourage these systems further. So I think this is an obstacle on to the transitions. So I think the crossovers are quite difficult now, but the good thing is that along the borders, especially along Thai-Myanmar borders, there are a lot of community-based organizations trying to promote transfers and then trying to promote education for children. So, which is a good thing. So I think, you know, my answer is not complete, but I will try to add more on as I can think more. And then I would again like to take this chance to touch on the online education, which is really important. Based on the evidence in Myanmar, that the survey was very recently done, the online education access is only about 5% of Myanmar school children. And then they do it not for main form of learning, but as a supplementary to their core learning. So that is true if we say online education is not doing as well as it should in Myanmar. And to pick up again on Liz's points about trust building, I think trust is really important. It is the key issue in many areas. Because of lack of trust, people do not collaborate anymore, even in private schools. But the answers might be to start from where you are and then start with some small and simple sample size. And then you can be a model of collaboration and you can be a model of good practice. And then that will also be good for your students as well. Sorry for going here and there. Thank you.
No, that's very good. And it also takes me back to the comment put by DFAT Yangon. I don't want to invite the embassy to make a comment unless they feel that they can. But it's interesting to see that, and it's logical, schools are the backbone of Myanmar's education system, and they should remain a key focus of Australia's support. I'd like to know at some good time what that support involves. If you're working through the Ministry of Education, does support get to where you want it to go? And what should we be doing in a body like AMI to try and make sure that support does go where it's most desperately needed? Do you feel able to say anything, DFAT? Please say no if you don't feel that you can. Okay, there were some questions about mental health resources. This would be a very difficult area to try to get into in the time that we've got available. And when you think about how the priorities are arranged for the education system, it would be difficult to see how they can actually bring the kind of support that is necessary for people who need that, especially when you have such a lot of people who are so traumatized and kids who are so badly affected by conflict around them that the mental health challenges must be very great. Khaing Phyu, do you see that from where you sit in Yangon?
Sorry, I missed your last question because I was reading Lynn's question and also trying to respond to the question on DFAT. So let me just first talk a little bit about DFAT. My experience of working with DFAT is they have been the most active education partner in Myanmar. So they were the first who set up a new program on education right after the coup. Many people were watching and waiting who would do it fast. So I definitely should acknowledge that to DFAT. And then on Lynn's question, I'm really happy to see this sort of investment. I think, there should be more investment done for people inside the country as well, who will not leave the country, but who will keep on building the bridges and who will keep on building the future. So sorry, Chris, please repeat that. May I hear the last question?
No, I was asking about the issue of trauma, traumatized children and mental health. Do you
Yes,
see
very good
demand
question.
for that issue, much support for that issue?
Yes, we make it a part of every education offer, the well-being and psychosocial support for children in the areas we work with in the education aid that we deliver in marginalized or hard to reach areas. Thanks.
Could I just add, there's a lot of research on this, even here in Australia within Indigenous and refugee children. There's a really direct connection between participation in schooling, success in schooling, ability to communicate at home, and issues of well-being and other characteristics of being not lost. And I could go on, and it gets into some very sad territory. But if children are feeling themselves drifting very badly in schooling, and schooling assimilates them away from their family connections and language and communication, there are really serious, the normal problems of growing up and adolescence become exacerbated considerably by the inability of parents to interact with them. And this happens when the language of the home starts to drift away between parents and children. And this is quite common. It happens here as well on a significant scale.
So it's Dr. Greg Raymond here. I met some of the presenters before they started when they were preparing. I've had over 35 years of medical education experience from Monash University, PhD. Spent time in Samoa as Associate Dean running the medical school there. And then recently I've done 10 years in Flinders, Northern Territory Medical Program. We're recruiting Indigenous doctors as well as non-Indigenous doctors up here. My point is more on, yes, we realise the students are stressed and there's counselling, but it's actually building a workforce in the mental health area, especially in rural remote. And is there opportunities to supply funding for students who are interested in that area to get rural bonded sort of programs going in Myanmar?
Thank you, Greg. I'm afraid we are right at almost at the end of our time. I want to ask another question which has come in, and it's about private schooling. Khaing Phyu, do you have any contact with the monastic education system? Because I guess still in the country, in rural areas especially, a very large number of kids are going to monastic schools.
Yes, there are about 1,500 monastic schools in Myanmar, and they are operating at different degrees of success. So for example, at Pangdor, you might know that, it is even thinking about offering beyond secondary education and degrees, etc. But for other monastic schools, most operate only at the primary level, and then they have been the sanctuaries for many vulnerable kids. But at the same time, there is division between them. There is distress among them because the leadership are abbots, and then politics and religion are intertwined, or people try to do so. So that is also a difficult period for them.
Good. Okay, well, it is now the hour. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and thank you for being such an active audience. Tintanu, you didn't ask any questions tonight. You normally have one every time. Do you have a question that you wanted to ask but haven't? No, you're on mute.
I did ask, actually.
Did you? I didn't see that. Okay, what is your question? It's always a good question.
Thank you.
In New South Wales.
Yeah, I have asked that if if you know, the people here have been doing, the Burmese diaspora is trying to educate as much as possible within our means. As you know, I have been financing some schools and libraries in Burma with my own money. I've set up Burma Education Fund with my own farm sales. And yeah, if there is a collaborated effort for the people here, it will be very good, so that you can guide us to do anything that we need. That's my statement, may I say.
I found your question now. I'm sorry that I didn't see it before and properly.
All right.
We are
It's
going
all
to
right.
continue to give a lot of attention to this. And now that we've had this very good experience of the visit from Khaing Phyu and the contact that's opened with the embassy and also with people in DFAT and other people in the community here, I think we will stay with this. And what we did last month on youth, this month on education, we will continue looking at how to produce or how to help Myanmar produce its own next generation of leaders.
Yeah, that's what.
That's absolutely critical. It would be terrible if we were able to see the democracy movement succeed, but then nobody there to carry the umbrella.
Yeah, we need the capacity building. So that's I am just doing within my means because of my former lecturer experiences and yeah, my former colleagues and junior staff that I have been trying to help as much as possible from my end. I think a lot of other academics, all academics living in Australia is doing the same as well, and also all over the world, the Burmese have been doing as much as possible.
You're one of our heroes, but now I'm afraid we have to say good night to each other.
Thank you, Chris.
See you at the end of August for our next seminar. We will come to you with the title of that in about a week. There's a few things happening right now that I'd rather like to give a chance to see how they develop before we come back to that, the title of next month's seminar. But for now, and for those of you who were here before we began, I can tell you that the big event involving Myanmar and China today, the cricket match between China and Myanmar in Kuala Lumpur for the elimination for the next World Cup, China beat Myanmar by 5 wickets. So, so on the basis of that, I say to you all, good night and thank you for being with us. And thank you, Joe. Thank you, Khaing Phyu. And Edgard, thank you for flying in from Singapore for this.
Thank you so much to you all.
Thank you.
Hope we can see each other again. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.